How do you know that a quadrilateral is, in fact, a parallelogram? Well, it turns out there are 5 ways to tell, or at least 5 main ways to tell. The first way is pretty much the given, and that is it fits the definition exactly. Both pairs of opposite sides are parallel. Therefore, this figure would have to be a parallelogram. So if you ever see these markings, you know it's a parallelogram. Second way that you can tell that a quadrilateral would have to be a parallelogram is if both pairs of opposite sides are congruent. So if this is congruent to this, and this side is congruent to this side, that means that this would have to be a parallelogram. Notice here that it doesn't directly show us something about the angles. That's fine. Also be careful that you don't mistake this for a rectangle. While this will be true in a rectangle, it doesn't necessarily mean that all of the angles would have to be 90 degrees. See how it's kind of like a rectangle that somebody sat on? That's for sure a parallelogram, but not all of the angles are 90. So it's not a rectangle. Okay, so how else could we tell? If you're like, well, I didn't have any of those markings. Well, what about this? If one pair of opposite sides is parallel and congruent, you could actually say that this is a parallelogram. Now, it doesn't matter which pair. So I could draw this in here and say, hey, look, they're the same length and they're parallel. That means that these would have to be part of a parallelogram. But I could have also done it, and I'm just going to do this in a different color so you don't get all the markings confused. I could have also said that for this pair. So I could have said this pair's parallel and it's also congruent. Try saying parallel like 50 times fast and see how that one goes, huh? I couldn't even do it once. But that's beside the point because we still have 2 more methods to look at. So again, it could be either pair. It doesn't need to be both, the blue or the red. Number 4, what if both pairs of opposite angles are congruent? That's another sign that this would have to be a parallelogram. So if you have these sorts of markings where the opposite angles are congruent, you would automatically be able to say this is a parallelogram, which means you could, of course, then draw in all of the other things that we've marked. And there's one other way to tell that a parallelogram is, in fact, a parallelogram, and that is that the diagonals bisect each other. So if you were to take a ruler, draw in your lovely diagonals, moving everything around, you would end up with them bisecting each other. So when you draw this in, traditionally, that will look like this. So if you ever see this picture, you could go, oh, that's a parallelogram, and I know a lot of information about a parallelogram. And the reason why that's so important, that you're able to identify parallelograms with a lot of different methods, is because if you're able to recognize something is a parallelogram, you're able to conclude a lot of things. Because even though this says nothing about the side lengths or angles, because I know it's a parallelogram, I'll be able to find things out about opposite angles being congruent and opposite sides being congruent. Same thing with here. This says nothing about the lines being parallel, and yet, just because their lengths are the same, I know that those opposite lines are parallel, and I know that the opposite angles are congruent. I also know that consecutive angles are supplementary. So this is all sorts of stuff I can find out. Same thing with diagonals, and with angles, and with congruent and parallel on a single side. All of those show you a lot more than what you started with. And sometimes in life, it's all just about taking that next step from the single thing that you're given. So let's try this out, though, looking at some specific instances. Now, you might end up with pictures like what we drew above on our chart, but sometimes you're going to have to kind of evaluate whether or not something's a parallelogram. And as you're doing so, you might find that there's not enough information. You might also find that you need to make a few conclusions first. So let's make those conclusions, or decide that we can't actually conclude anything. In this first one, notice how we're already given one piece of information. I know that this side is congruent to the other side, which means if I'm looking at my methods above, if I can say that the other 2 sides are congruent, Or I could say that the lines that I just had, those congruency marks, are parallel. I would have enough information to say this is a parallelogram. So either of these would be an option. Well, when I look at this, I don't have anything else about side length, but I do have more information about the angles here. These are not congruent angles, but since they're not opposite to each other, that's fine. It doesn't really tell me a ton in that sense. However, notice that these two angles are supplementary because 108 plus 72 is equal to 180. Now, if these are supplementary angles, and you think about the lines that they're on as if they were extended, notice that that means that these are parallel lines that this side is coming through because inside they form that 180 degrees, right? That supplementary pair here. So I'm able to say, just because these two are supplementary, that the lines containing EF and the line containing DG are parallel. Therefore, this is a parallelogram. And that is from number 3 of our chart. Opposite sides are parallel and congruent. Okay, so let's look at B. What about B? Well, in B, I'm given information about angles. I know that these two are congruent, and I know that these two are congruent. That's pretty great. However, in order to do anything with angles, I really only have one that talks directly about angles, and of course I have some information about parallel lines. The one that talks about angles says that opposite angles have to be congruent. In this case, our opposite angles are not congruent to each other, or at least I don't know if they are congruent to each other. And if I'm looking at supplementary pairs, which I did over here, I'm not actually told if these are supplementary or not. I only know that they're congruent here and congruent here. So at this point, I'd actually be stuck. I have no other things that I can draw in, and that means that I don't have enough information. And I can write that in. Now, a lot of times people think that if you cannot say, it's a parallelogram, that you really have something that's worthless. It's not worthless. I just don't have enough information at this time. I would need a few more pieces of information about maybe a congruent side or parallel things, or whether or not all of these are congruent to each other. And that in and of itself is a discovery. So finding out that you need more is not necessarily a bad thing. It's just a different sort of discovery. Let's look at C then. In C, I see that these are 90-degree angles. So I also know that they're congruent to each other. If I could say for sure that Y and Z were 90-degree angles, I would have that opposite angles are congruent. But I don't have anything on Y and Z. Let's see if I can do anything with parallel lines. Well, if this is 90, X is 90, and W is 90, that means that the line here containing XY and the line containing WZ, well, those would have to be parallel, right? Because 90 plus 90 equals 180. And we know that if the angles inside are supplementary, the lines that are being cut by the transversal here will have to be parallel. So I do know that these are parallel. Ooh, that's pretty important, right? But I don't have anything that talks about parallel and a pair of angles, right? I only have something that says both lines are parallel, or the side length is the same and it's parallel. And I don't know anything about this side length. For all I know, this side could, despite appearances, continue on pretty stinking far and be longer than the second side. Whereas this side could be short, despite the appearances, just a little bit. And that wouldn't actually be a parallelogram because this side is very clearly not parallel to this one. And since I have no restriction on the angle either, I have nothing to stop this from kind of like being that longer side and keeping these two lines from being parallel. That means that there's not enough information. Again, a good thing to discover. And that's what you're going to have to do each time. Sometimes you'll just find there's nothing you can conclude. Sometimes you'll find I concluded something, it just wasn't enough to get me where I wanted to be, and that's fine. And sometimes you're going to find that, hey, that little piece that I added was just enough to get me to parallelogram, which means I know a ton about that shape. That's it for today, though. What I would like you guys to do for homework is the following problems. Page 266, numbers 2 through 6 are all that I want you to do. Now, when you're looking at those ones, it will ask you to explain how you know, like state the theorem that justifies your answer. For that part, all you need to do is pick which one of these told you that information. I am going to let you just say the number that told you that information. Please watch out for a few of those. You will need to make some extra conclusions. Don't forget about what you know about the sum of all angles in a quadrilateral. That might help you out if you're running stuck. If you have any questions, feel free to ask them. I'll be around all day. Hope you guys are having a good time. See ya.